Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee, White Zulu, and I want to introduce you to my Christmas chapter. Well, it's not actually about Christmas, but since we will release it on Christmas Day, I thought I'd give you a little taste of a bit of festive gear, and I hope you can see them. I've got a little Minnie Mouse bow in tartan, and of course my famous flashing glasses. But unfortunately, I can't see anything without them. So I'm going to have to take them off so I can read my chapter. Anyway, you had a good look at them, and they're just a bit of fun, and they're going off now. Put my own glasses on so I can see. And here we go with chapter 15. Now this one is called Nun in Gumboots. As I've said before, our closest neighbour was the Roman Catholic mission at Mgeni Port, spelt P-O-O-R-T. That's because the Boer settlers had actually gone through the area before my great-grandfather bought the farm, but had had so much trouble from the Bushman raiders that they didn't settle and they moved on. But all the names around the area that we live in, our farm is in, have names like Onverwacht and Poort, as in P-O-O-R-T, meaning just a stream. So, Mgeni Port. Father Tertius was the resident priest, and I only knew him vaguely. He had a grey beard and drove a Volkswagen Beetle at 100 miles an hour along our dirt roads. My father called him Holy Smoke and said darkly, "He's a bloody danger to the rest of us. One of these days, one of us is going to meet him on a blind rise, and that'll be that. Perhaps it'll be that doctor," he added with some satisfaction. Our GP, Dr. Potter, also drove at top speed, tearing along right in the middle of the road with a great plume of brown dust flying from his wheels. When riding out exercising the polo ponies, we often came across white nuns walking in pairs or threes, wearing their habits, their hands folded in front of them, deep in prayer, as they took long walks along the dusty district road, which runs below our house. They nodded and smiled to us as we passed, and we knew that they weren't allowed to speak. It was a retreat as well as a mission station and convent. The new, youngest nuns, novitiates, came from the main Catholic convent at Marion Hill in Durban for a 2-year stint before taking their final vows. There was certainly no temptation out there in that remote and isolated place. About 12 older nuns ran the mission, as well as the farm the convent was situated on. "Take them down to Amalomeni to buy some sweets," Mum had said to Evalina. My little sister and I were going down to see the nuns, and I had a penny clutched tightly in my hot little hand. My mother had given it to me at the gate behind the kitchen, and off we went, me hopping up and down next to Evalina in excited anticipation at this rare and unexpected treat of buying sweets. I padded along behind her as she walked unhurriedly down the hill. She moved majestically for such a large woman, her broad, brown, bare feet planted solidly on the dusty road, as she carried herself with great dignity, back ramrod straight, and her head gracefully poised as if balancing a calabash of water on it, as she'd done all her life. I was mesmerized by the undulation of her powerful buttocks, like those of a Percheron, as they moved beneath the skirt of her dark blue cotton uniform. My sister, being only just a few months old, was tied to Evalina's broad back in a crocheted shawl, her white blonde curls almost hiding her face as she rested her head on Evalina's shoulder blade, her thumb plugged into her pink mouth. Nuns lived in an old farmhouse on the district road, way beyond our far boundary of gum and wattle trees. The district road runs below our house, crosses the Umgeni Port stream, and ends at a group of old buildings which formed the Roman Catholic convent. The original owners of Umgeni Port had found the steep, rough, bush-covered terrain too difficult to farm, and the Bushman raiders too much of an obstacle, and had sold up and moved to a small holding at Curry's Post, a district near Lions River. The Catholic Church had bought the place and moved a small group of French and Irish nuns in. Primarily a mission station, the convent also served as a retreat for novitiates. Apart from the old dining room and front veranda being converted into a small chapel, the rest of the building had remained the same, and the nuns slept in a new wing of cells. There was a tiny front parlour next to the chapel, into which guests were invited to sit and drink a cup of tea. My mother, being their one and only neighbour, had been their first invited guest of honour, and she had arrived back at home quite agitated. I was seated on a plain wooden chair and given a cup of tea on a saucer in one hand and a rather leathery crumpet with a fork on a dainty little plate in the other. I had to sit there and try and maneuver this lot around, attempting to cut the tough old crumpet with its tiny little fork, this tiny little fork, while juggling my teacup, while all the nuns sat around me and smiled and nodded. Only the Mother Superior spoke any English, and none of them ate or drank, as it was Lent or something. They were fasting, so I struggled along as they all watched me. I had a hell of a time, and I hope I never have to go back there, she muttered crossly. My father had refused to go anywhere near the nuns, but since he admired Sister Theophane, who was in charge of the dairy down there, he did offer to dip their cattle when he was doing ours. He and she were exactly the same age, he'd discovered. Amazing woman, he said, after she'd walked up from the convent one afternoon to ask him some advice on a cow with mastitis. She comes from a very good French family, aristocrats, I believe. She goes back from time to time to visit them in their chateau, she tells me. This went down very well with my parents. They loved the aristocracy, even if they were French. She's got those Abantu right under her thumb, too, Dad continued. I've never seen them work so hard. Even old Boniface, when he worked here, he was an idle bugger. That's why when Sister asked me if I knew of a herdsman, I said they could have him. He chuckled admiringly and shook his head before he returned to his newspaper. The convent was at the very end of the district road on the left side. As we walked, big wattle trees loomed up beside us, looking slightly menacing with their rough, pitch-black bark, here and there oozing sticky golden resin. Grandpa had planted them all to mark the brown boundary of our farm when they bought New Forest, or rather his father-in-law did. Glossy black fork-tailed drongos, izindengo, perched on the twigs of these trees, flicking their wings, ready to swoop down on an unwary grasshopper. Sun beat down quite fiercely on our heads as we moved out of the shade of our boundary trees. It was 3 o'clock, and the time that every creature lay still, except the cicadas, who screamed their shrill static from the bush. We crossed the stream, and I stopped as usual on the bridge, which is simply a few logs across the water, the gaps between them filled with earth. I dropped down on my belly to peer over the edge of the bridge at the water, flowing swiftly beneath at this time of the year. And Evalina called to me, exasperated. How, Suguma? Get up off that dusty road. You'll be filthy, and the nuns won't let you in. I skipped off again, and she quickened her stride, her square white pinafore billowing over the front of her ample bosom, giving the impression of a ship in full sail. I followed her large navy blue-clad bulk as we walked the last yards up the back drive of the mission station to the steps which led down to the big kitchen. Opposite the steps was a thatched mud hut which was ikliniki, a dispensary where the nuns held a daily clinic, giving inoculations and treating minor ailments, handing out cough medicine, disprin and worming remedies, but, as I learned later, not contraceptives, to the steady stream of Zulus who came every day for treatment, bringing their children and carrying their babies on their backs. They came from far away, sometimes as much as 10 miles, because the nearest dispensary was our GP in Nottingham Road, 20 miles from the mission. The nuns had a few jars of sweets on a shelf in the hut, and Evalina and I joined the already large throng of waiting women, whose chattering sounded like a flock of starlings. Some had untied their babies and were suckling them, seated straight-legged on grass mats they had unrolled from bundles. The older children peeped shyly from behind their mothers' long, full skirts, or stared boldly out of shiny black eyes at me in my shorts, scrubby t-shirt and bare feet. I was probably the first Umlungu child they'd ever seen. I stared back. The bell rang from the chapel, and the women gathered up their babies, grass mats, and bundles, and started making their way down the steps towards the sound of the bell. I saw a nun in a flowing, snowy white habit, her wimple covering everything but her pale pink, wrinkled face. Her robe reached down to her feet, and she had a soft, silky, dark brown rope tied around her waist, from the end of which dangled a big wooden cross. She walked out of the dark kitchen, jangling the brass handbell, and I wanted to join the stream of Zulus walking down the steps, but Evalina stopped me. Aibo, you can't go in with them. They're going to mass, she explained. Whose mass? I asked. Blah. Shush. They go and talk to Nkulunkulu, God, with the nuns. We must wait here to buy sweets, she insisted. I want to go with them, I replied. You can't, she said firmly. You're not Lomeni, Roman Catholic. Zulus can't pronounce R, and your mother will be very angry. I won't tell her. I was pleading now, but Evalina was adamant. She was terrified of my mother and would not risk any trouble if she was found out to be taking us to Roman Catholic service. None of the Zulus on our farm had been to the mission to be converted for the same reason. They believed in various gods and ancestral spirits, especially the evil one, the Tokolosh. As we waited, I could hear the women singing and then murmuring, and a bell rang now and again. I would have crept away to have a peep in the chapel if Evalina hadn't had her eagle eye on me all the time. She'd been resting her bulk on the low wall in the outside shade of the hut, her dusty bare feet crossed and her head bent forward, but I knew she was watching me. The bell rang again, and I heard women's voices rise to a wailing sort of song. And there was murmuring, chanting, and finally more singing, all interspersed by the jangle of that brass bell. After what seemed like an eternity, all the women and their children began to trickle back to the clinic, and another nun arrived with a large brass key tied to a wooden block by a piece of string. She unlocked the door of the clinic and gestured to the waiting women to form a queue. Evalina moved forward, holding me by the hand, and the nun smiled at us. Ah, Mrs. Ross's children, have you come to buy some sweeties? I nodded shyly and handed her my warm penny. The nun went to reach into an enormous glass jar which stood on a shelf and came back with a small brown paper packet. I looked inside, and there were several flat, chalky-looking sweets in the shape of hearts and flowers, all in pastel shades of pink, yellow, and green. Stamped on each sweet in curly red writing were words in Zulu, Ngiyathanda wena. I knew that means I love you, and I would later ask Mum what the others meant, since Evalina could not read even in Zulu. After thanking the nun, I asked her if I could go down to see Sister Theophane. Yes, of course, ma petite. She will be down at the milking now. Handing my precious bag of sweets to Evalina, I ran down the track to the tin-roofed sheds below the convent. Evalina followed me at her own pace and settled down under a tall gum tree at the side of the track. She untied the shawl holding my sister and spread it out in the shade, laying the sleepy little girl gently down. Then she leant back against the tree and closed her eyes. Sister, I called, and a small elderly nun popped her head out from the dark interior of a room next to the cow byre. Come in, ma petite. I'm separating the cream. She was in her full white habit, exactly like the other nuns, but she had tied a voluminous apron made from faded denim around her slight frame. She had then somehow pinned up the hem of her pristine white habit to reveal a pair of very muddy gumboots on her small feet. She was slowly turning the handle of the separator. Perched on top of her head over the wimple was a wide-brimmed straw hat neatly woven from grass for her by one of the Zulu women patients. I have a new calf. Would you like to see him when I have finished this? I jumped with joy. Yes, please, sister. What have you called him? His name is Challenger. He is a cheeky one, she chuckled. At that moment, Boniface, the nun's Zulu herdsman, put his head in at the door and asked Sister Theophane to come and check a cow's teats. I'll be there in a minute, she replied in her strange, mangled Zulu, spoken with a strong French accent. I could barely understand her, but all the staff on the convent farm jumped to it when Sister gave them orders, so they must have been tuned into her peculiar accent. Can I turn the handle then? I asked. I do it with ours at home to help Mackay. She looked uncertain. Please, sister, I begged. I know how, I promise. All right, but remember to turn the handle slowly and not to stop. And she hurried off, holding up her skirts, her boots clumping through the mud that always collected after Boniface had hosed out the milking shed. Diligently, I slowly turned the handle of the separator, at the same pace I'd seen her doing it. Time passed, and I turned and turned. It seemed that nothing was happening. A little while longer, I decided to investigate to see whether I was actually getting any cream from the trickle of milk which was running into the galvanized little metal bucket under the spout. Nothing much appeared to be flowing into the silvery little cream urn, just a drop or two. Carefully, and still turning the handle slowly, I raised my free hand to the shiny metal pin at the very top of the separator, unscrewed it, and lifted it up. It came away in my hand, and at the same time there was an eruption as a pale fountain spurted into the air and cascaded over me, covering me from head to foot in rich yellow jersey, cream. A gasp, I let go of the handle and stood there, dripping, still with the pin in my hand. All the metal filter cones had flown off with a centrifugal force, like small tin flying saucers, crashing into and ricocheting off the walls, leaving little pale half-moon spats, and then dropping noisily down onto the wet concrete floor in a pool of cream. "Oh mon Dieu!" shouted Sister Theophane as she walked back into the room. I panicked and, dropping the pin, tried to run, blinded by cream, and slipping and sliding in my bare feet on the slick floor. "Trou et très méchant," she scolded me, but I could hear a chuckle in her voice, and I stopped. "I'm very sorry, sister. I didn't mean to pull that pin out. Please don't be cross," I pleaded, almost in tears. "It is all right, ma petite. I can see it was not meant. Now go and get Evalina to help you clean up," she replied. We stood there at the tap outside the sheds, me and my Brooks, while Evalina rinsed and wrung out my cream-sodden shorts and top in cold water. Good-natured Sister Theophane flapped them out and hung them on a nearby barbed wire fence to dry. Come with me. Let us go and see that little calf now," said Sister Theophane. And there, in the byre, stood in a shaft of late afternoon sunlight, on his wobbly legs, was the most enchanting newborn calf I have ever seen. Golden and fluffy, he had great big liquid dark eyes with a fringe of beautiful long eyelashes. His tiny tail swished vigorously as he turned to butt his placid mother in the udder. Evalina was getting impatient as I stroked the calf's soft ears. "Come on, it's time to go home," she called from her place in the shade. "The sun will be going down soon, and it will be too dark to see." Oh, we said goodbye to Sister and plodded home along the cooling road. My clothes were still damp, but I didn't care. I would be given a bath when we got home anyway. I suspect that Sister Theophane, when she'd finished overseeing the cows' evening feeds, rushed back up to the chapel, shed her gumboots, and fell to her knees at the altar to pray fervently that the little Ross girl stayed away from her dairy, preferably forever. For many years afterwards, when we had left the farm, married, and had children of our own, every time we returned to the farm for a holiday, we continued to take the kids down to the convent to see our beloved Sister Theophane and admire her latest calf. The other treat, which we had also enjoyed as children, was to go and look at the nativity scene, which the nuns always created in their tiny chapel. It was always the same, a model representing the scene of Jesus Christ's birth, the baby surrounded by kneeling animals. This enchanting scene was displayed in front of the altar. Every Christmas Eve, we would walk down to the convent, our own children running alongside us, just as excited as we'd always been to see the tableau. Another annual Christmas ritual was when the nuns sent Boniface up with a bûche de Noël. This is a Yule log slathered in extremely rich Jersey cream, and which made my younger sister throw up every year, as she would always eat too much of it. Post-1994, after our country was handed over to the ANC, the Roman Catholic Church, which owned the farm the convent had run so well, rented it out to a hippie commune, having transferred the remaining few elderly nuns, most of whom were in their 80s by then, to a retirement convent up near the Rorke's Drift area in central KwaZulu-Natal. Shortly thereafter, we were wondering why we hadn't received our regular annual Christmas card from Sister Theophane. After my father had made a few inquiries at Marion Hill, he heard that a gang of black thugs had overrun the convent and gang raped those old nuns before murdering them all. This was the thanks they got for looking after the Zulus so tenderly for over 60 years. Umgeni Port became a real problem for my aging parents, now also in their 80s. There had been an enormous amount of faction fighting in the Zulu settlement of Mbandla because the ANC had bussed in huge numbers of their supporters during the 2 years before Mandela was released. Due to this, was it after the 2 years, however? Due to this, what had been the convent became overrun by Zulu refugees fleeing from all the fighting. These people camped out in the dense wattle plantations surrounding the main buildings. They stripped all the corrugated iron off the old dairy, milking sheds, and every other outbuilding. They built themselves rudimentary shelters with the sheets of metal and made themselves comfortable, surrounded by an endless supply of firewood and plenty of water from the Umgeni River nearby. There was no knowing how many squatters had moved in, but the hippies had absolutely no control over them. My parents began to feel the brunt of stock theft, their tractor being stolen, and attempts made to steal both bakkies, as well as their old BMW sedan. It was the end of an 80-year idyllic area. And that's it. I'm going to wish you all a very, very happy Christmas tomorrow, or whenever this is. I think this will be broadcast on Christmas Day. All of you have a very happy Christmas, and I shall see you before the new year. So this is goodbye from me for the time being, and thank you for listening. And I also want to thank John Moslane for putting all the amount of work he does and putting aside every Friday, which he does for me, to make these videos possible. And I will say goodbye to you all with this. Let's put this back on. Here's wishing you a very happy Christmas and a prosperous new year. Goodbye from me, and don't forget to visit my website, www.whitezulubook.com. Goodbye.